this first session of our webinar series called Social Infrastructure in the Post-COVID City. We'll make a brief introduction. I will give you some context, background elements, and then my friend Benoît Moritz will present you our speaker, and then we hope that we'll have the honor to hear from Eric Klinenberg. So my name is Mathieu Berger. I'm a professor of sociology at UC Louvain, the University of Louvain, and I'm leading the Metrolab.brussels group with my colleagues, architects and urban planners, Benoît Moritz and Geoffrey Grulois from ULB, University of Brussels. Metrolab is an interdisciplinary research group working in Brussels through action research projects, so applied forms of urban studies that we think can be useful to the public action, to city government and the urban civil society. That it could be useful at the region scale here in Brussels, but also maybe beyond Brussels and beyond Belgium. As we've seen lately, some interests in our work coming from people from other European cities and countries. So Metrolab, which is funded by a European policy program called ERDF, European Regional Development Fund. Metrolab has conducted research work in different domains that we identified as urban inclusion, urban ecology, and urban production. In our work on urban inclusion, we focused mainly on the built spaces and environments that have a role in including or excluding people in cities. So we focused on what our friend Miodrag Mitrasinovic has called infrastructures of inclusion, or more simply, as Eric Klinenberg calls them, social infrastructure. I invite you to have a look at our book published in 2018, Designing Urban Inclusion, which has been written by this collective of architects, urban planners, geographers, sociologists, anthropologists. You can download an electronic copy of the book from our website, www.metrolab.brussels. And the book provides analysis and recommendations for Brussels governments and people regarding these physical spaces and places that shape our capacity to connect with each other, to encourage our participation in collective life, to foster conditions that help us to support one another, which is, by the way, one definition that Eric Klinenberg gives to social infrastructure. Today, for obvious reasons, due to the realities of contagion, we are very concerned about the future of this social infrastructure. What is going to happen to these palaces for the people, to quote the title of Eric's famous book? That we could be facing a major crisis regarding our social infrastructure, our community facilities, our public interiors, or even more generally, our public places. Hence, this series of seminars on social infrastructure in the post-COVID city. Well, hopefully the post-COVID city, which is right now the COVID city. Today, in this first session of a cycle of 6 events, 6 Tuesday afternoons at 4:30 p.m., roughly, 4:30 p.m., we'll have the occasion to hear from specialists about the situation of the social infrastructure in our contemporary cities affected by the pandemic. And before Benoît Moritz introduces our guest today, I will quickly go through the program of this seminar, starting today and ending on January 19, 2021. So today's first session with Eric Klinenberg is entitled Social Infrastructure and the Future of Civic Life. And we guess that our guest today, Eric, is going to focus on the civic and democratic meaning of social infrastructure. It will be interesting to have his take on the US election and the ongoing situation from New York City, where he lives and works. Next week, actually, on November 24th, we will have the visit of Mark Pimlet. Mark Pimlet is an architect at TU Delft in the Netherlands, and is a specialist of public interiors conceived from an architectural perspective. Mark Pimlet has written many books on this question of the public interior, and mostly his book called Public Interiors. He will propose a talk entitled The Public Interior and Its Purpose, a Re-Evaluation. Then we will have other speakers. Maria Chiara Tozzi from the Institute of Architecture in Venice, Italy, with a talk entitled Welfare Space as Social Infrastructure. Then a philosopher, a French philosopher from the École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture de Grenoble, Céline Bonico-Donato, who will give us a talk called Crise sanitaire, crise des lieux publics. This talk will be in French, as you have guessed. So again, this is a webinar that will be mostly in English, but we will have some sessions in French as well. Then after Céline Bonico-Donato, on January 12th, we will have an urban planner, French urban planner from Paris, Bruno Yvain, who owns and works in an agency of urban planning called Agence Alphaville. And Bruno Yvain will talk about the programmation des infrastructures sociales à l'épreuve de la contagion. So we will have the inputs and insights from a practitioner of urban planning, which is always a good idea if you want to design places that will be relevant and COVID-proof, so to speak. Then we will end this series of talks and meetings with a more policy-oriented meeting and discussion with the political representative of Brussels Capital Region, and we will talk with them about the social infrastructure policy in Brussels and how all these developments from our seminar and from the insights that were collected from our different speakers can enlighten, in a way, a policy of social infrastructure in Brussels. Okay, so this is our program for the next 2 months. This first session isn't started and doesn't start easily, as you see, but we, you know, it's an experimental process, and and we hope that it will be smoother in the next times. So just some practical details, and that's if we can proceed. Today's session will be in English. We will hear Eric's talk. Then Benoit and I will have a few questions for Eric. Then after that, you will have the possibility to ask questions to Eric or to make comments. For that, we will ask you to post your questions on the chat section of this meeting. While Eric is talking, if you have a question, just post in the chat. Then during the second part of this meeting, Geoffrey Grulois, over here on my right, will collect all the questions, and he'll make a selection of the questions and comments for Eric. And if English is a problem for you, or if you understand English but struggle to write in English, just post your question in French or Dutch, and we will try to translate it. So one last thing, I'm thanking you for your presence, for your patience. Thank you so much. We're really a little bit embarrassed about the situation, of course. But thank you for holding on and staying with us. We thank Eric for being patient too, and for his talk today, hopefully. And we thank Louise Carlier, our colleague who worked with us to produce this program of seminars. We thank Sarah Cesari and Louise Proutot, who helped us with the communication and the practical aspects of this meeting. Then I'm not sure if Eric joined us already, but maybe we can now hear Benoit Moritz, so also co-leader of Metrolab.brussels and urban planner at the ULB, University of Brussels. and he will give you some words and present our speaker today. Thank you, Benoit.
Okay, hi to everyone. I'm Benoit Moritz. I'm a professor at the Faculty of Architecture here at the ULB, and I'm the co-coordinator of the Metrolab, together with Matthew and with Geoffrey. I put this back. So we are still having some trouble to get connected with Eric, and we're still working on it. And I hope that we will find a solution within the next few minutes. As you can see, Matthew has gone out of the room just to check if we can find a decent solution and a quick solution. So I will try to fill in the temporal space that I have the next few minutes to present you Eric Klinenberg, and I hope we will succeed to get connected with him. Well, the introduction I prepared was meant to be oriented towards Eric, so as he's not here, I will try to let's say reorganize it a bit. So at the Metrolab, we are very pleased to welcome Eric Klinenberg for this first conference, and I'm very honored to be able to say a few words to introduce his lecture. I hope that he will be able to give his lecture. So Eric Klinenberg is an American sociologist and scholar of urban studies, culture, and media. He's also a professor of sociology and director of graduate studies at NYU, New York University, where me and Matthew had the honor last year to visit him to give a lecture at the Institute of Public Knowledge, where Eric Klinenberg is director since 2012. He is author of several books, like Going Solo, a book published in 2012, which analyzes the rise of solo living and its impact on culture, business, and politics. Another book, Fighting for Air, The Battle to Control America's Media, a book published in 2007 that shows how corporate ownership and control of local media has remade American political and cultural life a very contemporary subject. Eric is also an author who is sensitive to the social issues linked to the climate change. In 2013, Eric, I see that you're here. Yeah. Are you here, Eric?
I'm here. Hello.
Okay, great. Nice to hear you.
This is a perfect setup for a talk about why physical places are better than virtual.
Yeah, great.
For sure.
I think, Matthew, maybe you planned it this way.
Yeah. I'm not sure, Eric. I was quite stressed. I will continue the introduction and we will give you the floor after this. Let's just finish my introduction, Eric. It's very nice to hear you.
Likewise.
Eric is also an author who is sensitive to the social issues linked to the climate change. In 2013, he wrote an influential article in The New Yorker on Hurricane Sandy and climate change adaptation. In this article, Eric Klinenberg explains the role of social infrastructure in protecting cities and communities. Already in 2002, Eric's first book, Heat Wave, a social autopsy of a disaster in Chicago, described the way in which the heat wave is experienced in a very differentiated way according to the sociology and social economical level of the neighborhoods of Chicago. In 2018, the last book Eric has written was published. So it's Palaces for the People, a very inspiring book for us at the Metrolab. A book in which, by looking at the social side of our physical space, Eric Klinenberg offers a new perspective on what people and places have to do with each other. So today, Eric, as the world is still facing a pandemic, we are very pleased to have you with us for this lecture and to hear the reflection that this current situation of global sanitary crisis have inspired to you. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have no idea if anyone is still here. If anyone is still here, thank you for waiting all this time.
Yeah, we have 53 people.
Okay, well, you have 53 very patient people.
Right.
So I appreciate it. And I apologize for not wearing a mask, but I want you to know I've read the latest science, and I think I can't spread the COVID to you. The coronavirus is not going to spread from me to you if I don't wear a mask today, so I'm going to have my mask off. Nope, that's okay.
It's good for one time, huh?
So I guess the first thing I'd like to do is say, you know, I'm really honored to be part of this seminar series and to be the first speaker in your group. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
And I'm hearing sirens there.
Yeah,
and you're probably hearing a lot of banging over here, which I can't really do anything about because it's New York. But the sirens I'm hearing there sound very familiar to me because New York, as you surely know, is one of the epicenters of the COVID-19 pandemic. And although things are, you know, considerably better now than they were in March and April of 2020, in March and April of 2020, things were really miserable and dark here. And the sound of sirens was a constant feature of everyday life in New York. You know, you could hear sirens every few minutes taking people to the hospitals, and they never really ended. So it was that sound that I hear even through the screen is a sign of you know, how in some way we're connected in this experience. I don't know if the sirens in Brussels are sirens from COVID, but we've just gotten accustomed to hearing sirens all the time, and unfortunately, I fear that a lot of that is coming back. So I guess the way I would like to begin is I'd like to take you back to March of 2020, not just the sirens, but you might remember at the time the World Health Organization issued a call where they said that the pandemic was spreading. There was no way to reduce the damage from medications, and they said that because the virus is spreading uncontrollably, the best thing that you can do to stay safe now is to be socially distant. I don't know if that phrase circulated as much in Europe as it did in the US, but the idea was that social distance is what was going to protect us. And I understood what the World Health Organization meant when they called for social distance. I understood that idea. But it struck me that the concept itself was exactly wrong, because it's actually not social closeness, social proximity, that puts people at risk during an infectious disease pandemic. It's not how much contact we have with each other socially. It's physical contact that makes a difference, right? It's if we're physically close to each other, that if we sneeze or cough or breathe even, we run the risk of spreading the disease. So we needed, I realized, physical distance, but actually what we really need to survive this pandemic is social proximity. Or even better, we need social solidarity. And solidarity is a core concept in my field, sociology, from the work of Emile Durkheim, through the labor movements of the early 20th and mid 20th century. And it has become more salient today, because it's during a moment like this, when we're in a pandemic, that we really come to realize the extent to which our fate as an individual is linked to the fate of the other individuals and groups around us, right? If we live in a society where we don't provide enough education so that the people who live near us understand the difference between a novel, lethal coronavirus and an ordinary flu, then they will refuse to change their behavior, to wear a mask, to keep physically distant. If we live in a society where we don't protect workers, so that if you have a low-wage job serving food in a restaurant or a fast food outlet, if you don't feel protected at work, you might go to work even though you're sick, because you don't want to lose your job. So you'll go to work sick, and then you'll spread the disease to all the people who you're serving food to. And ordinarily, I think a lot of us take those things for granted, but in a pandemic, you really see all of the ways in which we are in fact connected, even if we don't want to be. And so it struck me right away that this experience of the pandemic could be an occasion for recognizing how important social proximity and social solidarity is. And so I wrote back to the World Health Organization and started campaigns here in the United States and eventually globally saying, it's not social distance, it's physical distance. Let's change the vocabulary. We've had a modest success with that, and maybe you hear physical distancing more than social distancing today. I sure hope you do. In recent years, or in recent months, I have been thinking a lot about the first major research project that I conducted, which I did years ago. It was a book about a great heat wave in the city where I grew up, Chicago, in the center of the United States. And it was the case when I really learned the significance of social connection and the danger of social disconnection. I wrote about an event in July of 1995 when more than 700 people died in just a few days, and a great number of them died because they were alone and left unattended by people around them, their friends, their family, their neighbors, social service agencies from the government. And I could see when I started research on this project that this was really a story about the danger of disconnection in contemporary life. And when I decided to do a project, a sociological project about the heat wave, I knew that one danger is that it's easy to, we say in the United States, spend a lot of time kicking open an open door, which is to say, many things about what happened in the heat wave were quite predictable and didn't require sociological research. So for instance, you could predict that the neighborhoods in Chicago that would be damaged the most, that would have the most death and illness, were the poorest neighborhoods, the segregated neighborhoods, racially segregated neighborhoods, places where there's everyday vulnerability. And so of course there would be vulnerability during a crisis. And sure enough, that was definitely the case in the heat wave. Just as in COVID, we're seeing that everyday inequalities matter in a pandemic or in a catastrophe. That was true. But what became sociologically interesting and what really sparked several decades of research for me is when I looked more closely at what happened in the heat wave, I noticed that there were a number of neighborhoods in Chicago that had the same poverty level, that had the same segregation level, that looked on paper as if they were basically identical, and that on a map were even directly across the street from one another, neighborhoods that were just touching one another. They looked like they would have the same experience in the crisis, but what I learned when I dug very deeply is that, in fact, there were incredible disparities at the neighborhood level, even when you looked at places that were demographically similar. And I wanted to explore more. And what I found is that what really made the difference in the capacity of a neighborhood in a city to survive a crisis, what made one place resilient, is to use the word we use now, and what made another place vulnerable, was not simply race or segregation or poverty. It turned out to be what I've come to call the social infrastructure, the set of physical places and organizations that shape our capacity to interact with each other. Let me be really clear about that. The thing I'm talking about here is a concept that I call social infrastructure. I use it a little bit differently than I think it's used in Europe. I don't mean all the institutions and organizations that provide health and education and recreation and all those things. When I say social infrastructure, I'm specifically referring to the physical places that shape our capacity to interact with each other. And I'm going to go into that in great detail. In Chicago, what I saw is that the neighborhoods that had very high death rates had a depleted social infrastructure. They had a lot of abandoned houses. They had a lot of empty lots. They did not have an active commercial corridor of restaurants and shops that drew people out of their homes and into public life. They did not have strong nonprofit organizations or community organizations. They did not have strong libraries and parks and things like that. The neighborhoods that were poor and segregated and vulnerable on paper, but that actually proved to be resilient in the heat wave, were neighborhoods that, on the contrary, had a very strong social infrastructure. Despite all of their problems, the sidewalks were intact. They had a lot of street life. They had a strong number of commercial outlets, parks, libraries, other facilities that brought people together. And what that meant is the social infrastructure of the neighborhood established a set of places where people could engage in regular, recurrent interaction. And that means that if someone doesn't come outside to the place where they always go every day, if they're not at the local cafe where they tend to go, if they're not at the pub or the bar where they go, or the restaurant, or if they're not sitting on the bench in the park, their neighbors know that they're not there, and they know to knock on the door and check up on them. And the difference between the neighborhoods that were poor but survived and the neighborhoods that were poor but died is that the ones where there was a lot of death didn't have those places, didn't have that rhythm of social life. And fundamentally, I learned and argued they didn't have that social infrastructure. So that idea of social infrastructure has been the focus of my research for many years now. And when I say social infrastructure, I don't mean it as a metaphor. I'm not using infrastructure as a metaphor. I believe that there is a social infrastructure that is just as real as the infrastructure for power, energy, for communications, for transit, for water. We just don't have a concept robust enough to identify it and distinguish its various features. And so we haven't used it, and we haven't thought about its role in city making or in place making. We haven't thought about how to incorporate it into design. But it's my argument, and this is the argument of Palaces for the People, that when you invest into social infrastructure, when you design it well, when you build it well, when you maintain it, that's really important. You have to not just build it, but also maintain it, make sure it continues to work well, and especially when you program it. If you do all of that, you significantly enrich the place where you live. You significantly enrich the social life, the civic life of your city or town or community. But at the same time, if you fail to invest in social infrastructure, if you fail to build it well, if you fail to design it well, if you fail to maintain it or to program it, people become much less likely to engage with the other people who live or work around them, and they become more likely to, spend time on one of these, on their screen in their home, than out in the world. So, for instance, if you want to understand the role of social infrastructure, consider the fairly modern invention of a playground in a neighborhood, a little park with swings or climbing equipment, a place where children can come to play. If you live in a neighborhood that is within walking distance of a well-designed, well-built, well-maintained, and well-programmed playground, that place will be a magnet, not just for children who will interact with each other, but also for the people who take care of them, their parents, their grandparents, their sitters. And what happens in the everyday life of cities is that when people spend enough time going to the same place over and over again, not because they're looking to build relationships, not because they're looking to build something like community, not because they're trying to promote their social life, but just because they want to do something that they enjoy doing. When you go often enough, inevitably you wind up engaging in informal conversations with people, and the conversation between two parents pushing the same two children on the same swing set eventually turns into what we call in the United States a play date. The kids get together, the families get together, friends meet other friends. That's how social worlds are developed. And I like to ask people when I'm giving lectures in the United States, if I'm in the city of New York or the city of Chicago or the city of San Francisco, how many relationships do you think exist in this city because two families met each other at the same playground on the same weekends or the same afternoons, over the last 10 years? How many relationships are there that exist because of a place like that? And of course, it's a ridiculous question that we'll never know the answer to. But I will just say the answer is closer to the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, than it is to 10 or 20. These kinds of things are the core of our social world. But strangely, we haven't had a name for it. So I left Chicago after I wrote this book about the heat wave there. I became a professor at New York University. I run this thing called the Institute for Public Knowledge, which is a multidisciplinary research center. We do a lot of public projects. We do a lot of research. We do a lot of public events. And I was living and working in New York when Hurricane Sandy hit the east coast of the United States in 2012. And when it happened, I knew right away that this was a significant event for the United States, that it had the capacity to be kind of a wake-up call on climate change. It did a tremendous amount of damage in New York City. It caused more than $60 billion of economic damage, and just shredded the infrastructure of New York. The tunnels for the subway system filled up like bathtubs. There was massive storm surge that came in from the Hudson River and from the East River, and inundated Manhattan. The power went out in the center of global capitalism for 1 week. Tens of millions of people across America lost power. It was a truly extraordinary event. And afterwards, I assembled a set of researchers at New York University to come together and start investigating what happened and what broke down. And I wound up writing an article, in the New Yorker magazine about adaptation and the failure of the city to be ready for an event like this, and its vulnerability for future events. And I wrote at length about social infrastructure and how it matters in that article. And a few weeks after I wrote that article, I was sitting at my desk and I got a call from someone in President Barack Obama's administration. And it's been a very long time, so I don't know if all of you remember that we used to have a president in the United States named Barack Obama, and we used to be part of the first world. We believed in science and the Enlightenment and things like that, and it was a very long time ago. But trust me, we used to do that. And the Obama administration called and they asked me, would you be willing to be the research director for a competition that we're calling Rebuild by Design, in which we're going to invite architects and landscape architects and engineers and city planners from around the world to come to the region around New York and propose ideas for infrastructure that would work in the 21st century. And the idea was that this wouldn't be an ordinary design competition. We would start with a 9-month process where the teams that were selected would not be selected. They'd be selected based on the mission statement they wrote and who was a participant in the team. They would not be selected based on a specific plan. No specific proposals were allowed in the submission stage. But the final teams would have to go through a 9-month process that involved 3 months of research and 3 months of outreach with stakeholders in the different areas in the region, and then 3 months of collaborative participatory design, all before they could actually enter a design idea into the competition finals. So we got 150 teams from around the world. 10 teams were finalists. I think 8 of the 10 teams had engineers from the Netherlands, Dutch engineers who came to talk about water management, which is a topic we had a lot to learn from them. And we spent this period of time together trying to come up with innovative infrastructure ideas in a country, the United States, that is decades behind when it comes to infrastructure development. And because I was the research director, I had the capacity to say to the groups, all of the designs you're making, no matter what they're for, even if it's for something like a flood management system, they have to incorporate social infrastructure. They have to have multiple dimensions, right? So even if what you're trying to do is keep an area that's on a riverfront keep it dry so that it doesn't get affected by a storm, you still have to think about how you could incorporate a social infrastructure component into that plan. and it was a very exciting time. And there was a moment where I was working with one of the design teams that was really struggling to come up with a plan that was as ambitious and exciting as it needed to be to potentially win $1 billion or more from the federal government. I guess I forgot to tell you that what was really amazing about this design competition is that there were at least $2 billion of federal money on the table, and potentially much more. So, some of these big projects are going to get built. And this one team was really struggling with what it wanted to do, and they finally came to me one day and they said, Eric, we've figured out a plan. We've come up with a prototype for a new building that we think we could build in communities and cities across the United States. Frankly, they said, we think we could build this all over the world. It's an idea for what we're calling a resilience center. Would you like to hear about the resilience center? And I said, absolutely, that sounds like a fascinating thing. Tell me about it. And they said, imagine, if you can, that you had a building that you could put in every neighborhood, and it was a public building that was accessible to everyone. It was open to everyone. It was staffed by public employees who are resilience experts, and their job was to be almost aggressively welcoming to everyone in the neighborhood. The idea is that if you live near a resilience center, the resilience center should be your home away from home. And they said, we want everyone to feel welcome there. We are especially interested in making sure that very young people and older people can use the Resilience Center, because we know that they're the most rooted in the neighborhood where they live. So that local social infrastructure really matters for them. And they said, we know we have to have programs to attract them. And so for younger people, we could have stories in the morning, story hour, we'd read books to them, we'd have sing-alongs, we could do craft programs, different things. We'd have special rooms for young people where they could come together. They said, we know that they would have adults with them, their parents or grandparents, so we'll have comfortable places for them to sit, and we can have Wi-Fi access, which you can't take for granted in the United States because it's not everywhere. We would have computers and tablets that people could use when they're there. They said for older people, we would have book clubs, reading rooms. We would have periodicals, newspapers, magazines. We could do film nights, a lot of cultural program. We could do crafts for them too. And they said, we want these things really to be open to everyone. And we think that the idea is that if people come to this place all the time, then if there's a crisis, they'll know that there's a place where they can come together. Or if it's something like a pandemic and you can't physically be together, they'll know they can come here to get reliable information, and we can set up things outside so it's safe. They're very excited about this idea, and as you know, I'm a professor, and so I'm used to people proposing ideas to me, and you always have to be, you have to be thoughtful about how you respond. And so I responded to them the way I would respond to students when they propose something. I said, I think, this is a very interesting idea. I can tell you've worked hard on it. But I also said to them, given where we were in the United States, I just wonder, have you ever been to a library? And I asked them that question because in the United States, and I don't know about Belgium, but in the United States, we have a fairly impoverished social infrastructure generally, but we have this remarkable system of local, we call them branch, local public libraries, which are in almost every neighborhood of every American city and in every suburb and in every small town. And the libraries are extraordinary things in the United States. They came during the progressive era in the beginning of the 20th century. A lot of them were built, not most of them, but many were built with money from philanthropists. Andrew Carnegie is kind of one of the major barons of the Gilded Age in the United States, and an immigrant himself gave the equivalent of about $2.5 billion during his time to build branch libraries, local libraries around the world, really. But the deal was that he would give local governments money to help build libraries on the condition that they then became public institutions, fully funded by government, plus whatever they could raise if they wanted to raise charitable funds, as governments do in the United States, oddly. And so we have this network of libraries across the United States that are kind of remarkable facilities, potentially. During good times, they are open 5, 6, or 7 days a week from morning until the evening. Remarkably, they are open to everyone. You can use a public library in the United States regardless of your social class, regardless of your race or ethnicity, regardless of your age, regardless of your citizenship status, right? Donald Trump could not build a wall to lock people out of the libraries as much as he would have liked to. They are staffed by public employees called librarians. They are full of books and magazines and periodicals and videos. They offer people Wi-Fi access. They offer people computer access. They have all variety of classes. They actually provide more citizenship classes than any other public institution. They provide more English as a second language instruction than any institution. They have all kinds of things that they lend to people, including outfits for job interviews for low-income people, seeds if you want to garden, tools if you want to do a house project. The American Public Library capacity is extraordinary, but for one problem, which is that, as in other parts of the world, and I know the UK case much better than the Belgian case, libraries have been seen as either antiquated, kind of no longer necessary in a digital age, because people get information and books and magazines on the internet, on their phone, rather than in a physical place like a library, or they're seen as luxuries, things that, if you're a government, you fund and support with public resources only if you are flush with money, because otherwise there are other things that are more important. But what I observed as I was doing research on social infrastructure, in part based on my experience with this design team for Rebuild by Design that said they wanted to build a resilience center, what I observed is that, in fact, libraries during ordinary times can function like resilience centers on a daily basis. But they only can do it if they're open, if they have a budget to pay for librarians, if they're programmed, if they're maintained. And what has happened in the US and what has happened in the UK and what has happened to governments around the world as they've entered into this period of austerity is that the fiscal crisis means there is no more budget for things like the library, or maintaining the park, or maintaining the playground, or opening up the school so that it's accessible to people in a community. What I'm saying is that there's a thing called social infrastructure that's critical to the health of our societies, that's critical to the health of our civic life. They matter during crises, but they also matter every day. And we ignore them at our peril. And in the United States, we have been ignoring them and neglecting them. And it is my impression that many other parts of the world are doing the same thing. In fact, in Palaces for the People, I go to other places, several other nations, and look closely at just how those public spaces, these public gathering places, like libraries or parks or playgrounds or athletic fields, are treated. And it won't be a surprise to you to learn that I am especially concerned about what will happen to these kinds of places as we move into the post-pandemic period, in which governments around the world find that they have accumulated extraordinary debt to get through the worst of the pandemic. I'm quite concerned about a new period of fiscal austerity that makes states reluctant to fund things that they see as luxuries, but that I see as essential, vital social infrastructure. I think it would be a horrible mistake to do this, because social infrastructure is the thing that makes the difference between a society that's going to be highly polarized and distrustful and a society that has some capacity to rebuild and to sustain itself. Now, I want to be very clear about something. My argument in this book and my argument to you today is not that this is a simple thing and that building a library or a playground or a park is enough to heal social divisions and bring people together. We live in a time where there is dangerous political extremism, especially on the right. We live in a time where there's tremendous pressure to spend more time on screens and less time with other people. We live in a time full of anxiety and dread. And let's be clear also that during a pandemic, the thing that social infrastructure is generally very good at doing, which is bringing people together so that they can establish some bonds of solidarity face to face, is actually dangerous, right? And as I said at the beginning, during a pandemic, you want social proximity, you want social connection, you want social solidarity, but you don't want physical proximity, right? We still need to have physical distance. And so you can't just bring people together inside of a library, but maybe you can bring people together in a distant way in a public park, or maybe children can be together outdoors on a playground. Maybe that's better for them than being indoors. So it's not as if the thing is irrelevant. I am deeply concerned today, and I want to make sure we have a lot of time for a conversation, even though we started very late. I'm very concerned that our failure to recognize both the fact of social infrastructure, our lack of a concept for this, and also our refusal to take social infrastructure seriously and the elements of social infrastructure seriously in city planning, in governance, in infrastructure planning, is going to make it difficult for us to recover and rebuild. And, you know, again, my view here is it's not that if just building parks and playgrounds and libraries is going to turn everything around. It's that if the project before us as we get out of the pandemic in many divided societies around the world is to figure out how we reestablish some sense of common purpose, to try to rebuild the elementary forms of civil society, of collective life that Durkheim spoke about and wrote about more than a century ago. If that is our challenge, I don't believe we're going to get there on Twitter or on Microsoft or on Facebook or on Zoom. I know we all love our devices. And I know that Mark Zuckerberg is out there telling everyone, if you want meaningful community experience, Facebook is here for you. In fact, I gave a talk at Facebook a few years ago, and a few months later, I gave a talk about social infrastructure, and a few months later, Mark Zuckerberg was telling everyone that Facebook is actually the great social infrastructure of the 21st century, and that Facebook is the place that we should go for meaningful community engagement. And it is my strong contention that if our goal is to rebuild and do something to revitalize democratic societies, we are much more likely to do that in a library or a park or some piece of physical infrastructure where we can be face to face, where we can encounter the reality of each other and all of our differences face to face. We have a much better chance of doing it that way than we do of rebuilding society on social media or on Microsoft Teams, which is not an insult at the great technology that has us all here together. But like I said at the beginning of my lecture, I think we witnessed and experienced in these first 30 minutes when we were all waiting, frustrated, angry, maybe sending off nasty notes to other people about how horrible the world is, maybe tweeting about things that divide us. Those are the kind of experiences that are going to further divide us. And it's my contention that building social infrastructure is not just going to be useful for the next pandemic or the next heat wave or the next hurricane. It's also going to be fundamental to rebuilding. We are going to spend trillions of dollars around the world in the next decades on infrastructure. The world needs new infrastructure. I've yet to go to a country where the first thing people say to me when I get off the airplane is, what you're going to love about this country is how amazing this infrastructure is. Even Singapore, Seoul, Tokyo, the infrastructure is aging and needs to be rebuilt. As we retool for the 21st century, the argument I'm making to you today is we need to think about social infrastructure and how it matters. And here's an extraordinary place where people who care about cities, people who do planning, people who do design, and people who do social science can come together with people who are acting in civil society to make a better world. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we have some time for conversation. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eric. And you're right. It's interesting to leave enough time for discussion, and we're very thrilled to be able to have you and to talk with you about these issues. Maybe we can stress a little bit more the civic dimension of your talk today, which was about social infrastructure and the future of civic life. So I had a first question that would be about this. Maybe I'm sure that my colleagues also have questions. Actually, I have two questions.
Okay.
Maybe you can take our questions and give us some answers after that. Okay.
Sure.
Okay, and then we will open the discussion to our audience. And I take advantage of this situation to thank our audience. Thank you guys for staying tuned with us. I believe that we're still 55 participants and that we didn't really lose participants in spite of the technical issues. So that's I guess that's an indication of your interest for this seminar. So thank you. Yes, I had a first question about libraries and their the way the public libraries are perceived in the US. Because in your work and for a lot of people that you've been observing and following these last years, they're very important places. They have an infrastructural role to play. But it is true that for a lot of other people, they do not appear as infrastructure for their own life because they don't visit or use these libraries. And many people may have a very pejorative understanding of public libraries and of social establishment or public social establishment in general. So I guess there is like a cultural challenge that people like you are facing in your struggle to make these palaces for the people more respected, more understood for their importance. And to get eventually some more funding to develop them. So I will give you just an instance of what I'm talking about, because this sort of despise for the public infrastructure and the public places and public establishments is not only, you don't find this only among Republicans or like, let's say, Trump supporters, who consider libraries as, of course, too expensive for the taxpayer and as a luxury, like you said. I think that even among Democrats and among the progressive elite, there is a lot of irony and cynicism regarding what is public, especially maybe for libraries or for public libraries. So, you know, the other day, that's just an example, but the other day I was watching a good old Seinfeld episode. You know, Seinfeld is very typically New York sitcom. So Jerry Seinfeld in his little show that he makes, you know, during an episode, you have some excerpts of his stand-up comedy. He says this, I'm quoting Seinfeld: "What's amazing to me about the library is it's a place where you go in and you can take out any book you want, they just give it to you and say, bring it back when you're done. It reminds me of this pathetic friend that everybody had when they were a little kid, who would let you borrow any of his stuff if you would just be his friend. That's what the library is, a government-funded pathetic friend." And this is, you know, what is I guess important in this is that, of course, Jerry Seinfeld is not your typical, you know, far right or conservative character. You know, it's I guess you will more associate him to a more progressive and Democrat and yes, part of the U.S. So I had a question about that. I think that it's a very common and widespread attitude in the US. And it's not only about the social establishments such as public libraries, but beyond the social infrastructure, I think that its attitude extends also to the civic infrastructure. And for instance, all these places like community centers or city halls where people are supposed to go to participate in the public business. And I've been studying participation in Los Angeles at the Los Angeles City Hall, and people who attend actually the sessions of the Los Angeles City Council. Citizens that can go to attend these sessions and make public comments and participate in the affairs of the city. And it is true that you will find the same crowd that you find in most public libraries in Los Angeles, which is marginal people, homeless people, and basically people who live around this area, which is downtown Los Angeles. So you have a lot of people coming from Skid Row and from this neighborhood because it's very close. So for a lot of people who watch these sessions of the city council because they are present there, or they just watch it on TV on the public channel, they have this understanding that actually the public participation and citizenship is for weirdos and crazy people or people that are not like them at all. So there is this sort of estrangement of the American people towards maybe social infrastructure and civic infrastructure.
I
will stop there. Sorry.
No, I understand your question. So let me say more about this. I think you're making a very important point, and it's worth spending some time thinking about this. So first of all, you should know about the United States that while in some why do you only wear your mask when you're speaking to me? I mean, that's interesting. So you keep your mask off. Now your mask is back on now.
I'm trying not to spray my my colleagues with my while I'm talking, but after that I can just
your mask, and when you don't talk, you take your mask off.
A little bit, just to take some fresh air.
I mean, cultural diversity is an amazing thing, isn't it?
No, I know this is irrational and totally interesting on a sociological level. So yeah.
Okay, so I think this is a really big issue about kind of the stigma and the public realm and kind of public institutions generally. And I want to point out a few things here. First of all, you should know that we often talk about the United States as if it prizes the market and the kind of the private sector, and it denigrates the public sector and doesn't care about public institutions. This is really wrong. You need to understand this. For instance, if you go to the middle class and affluent suburbs where enormous numbers of Americans live, the suburbs are built on amazing public infrastructure and public goods. You will find in the wealthiest suburbs in the United States beautiful libraries, and the wealthiest people in town will go to the library as a community center and use it. And the wealthiest families send their kids there with their babysitters. And they send their children to their public schools because the public schools are amazing. And the public fields, the athletic fields and recreational areas in middle class and affluent suburbs, they look like country clubs, and everyone uses them. And the public parks are used well. So what you need to understand first is that it's too much of a generalization to say that Americans denigrate and stigmatize the public sector. Even like the great public universities of the United States, University of California, Berkeley, where I got my PhD, University of California, Los Angeles, the University of Michigan, the University of Virginia, the University of Wisconsin and Madison. These are University of Texas and Austin. These are extraordinary places, highly esteemed among the great public institutions of the world. Okay. But where is the public sector really reviled and stigmatized the most? In cities. And and really only in certain parts of cities. So if it's an affluent neighborhood, it'll be better. But why does that happen? Well, the reason is that the United States has such a stingy safety net. We have such a thin safety net. We have so few social programs to provide protection for people who are very poor, or people who have mental illness, or people who are addicted to drugs, or people who are very old, that if you have that condition in the United States, or especially people who are, you're more likely to become homeless, you're more likely to have really major problems, and to have nowhere to go because the public sector does not take care of you. That doesn't matter in the suburbs, right? Because that population doesn't exist there. That population is much more concentrated in the center city. There's poverty in some suburbs near cities, but in the middle class and affluent suburbs, you don't have much of it. So what happens when you don't have a safety net is that places like libraries become the place of last resort for everyone who has a need. So the amazing thing about American libraries is that they're open to everyone, they're accessible to everyone, they don't really kick you out, they have a bathroom, they have heating in the winter, they have cooling and air conditioning in the summer, right? They have internet access, they have computers. So if you have nothing in the United States, the library is the best place you can go. And that is really a failure of the American social system, of the welfare state, and it has put enormous pressure on libraries. So it is true that if you go to the Los Angeles Public Library, the Central Library downtown, or if you go to the Central Library in San Francisco or the Central Library in Chicago, you will find a lot of homeless people and you will find a lot of mental illness. And if you go to many neighborhoods, you'll find that too. But if you go deeper into the library, you will actually find that there are far more people who are not homeless, who are not sick, who are not very poor, who are not destitute. And so then the problem becomes affluent and politically influential people associate those public places with social problems. The places get stigmatized and people don't want to support them. And that makes it all the more difficult to get public resources for those institutions, in those communities, right? Because we associate that public realm with people who have needs. But I'll tell you something that's very interesting. So I think this is a huge problem in the United States, that there is a class of people, there are a class of like the most affluent people who live in cities who have rejected places like libraries because they associate them with homelessness and other social problems, and they've gone for private solutions, whether it's Amazon or private social clubs or just Starbucks and restaurants. I don't think you find this in the suburbs. I do think you find this in cities, but it is a major problem. And what I tell people in the United States when I speak to very affluent communities is, first of all, that going to the library should be for you a way of checking reality, because to the extent that we live in a segregated world where we surround ourselves with other people who are in our class situation, or share our racial identity, we make it very easy to blind ourselves to the reality of what we're living through, of the society we've created. And at first I tell people, if you want to understand what your city is, the first thing you should do is go to a library. And honestly, for any of you, if imagine the pandemic is over and you can get on an airplane and come visit the United States in the future. I hope that happens, before too long. When you come visit the United States and you decide to go to San Francisco or New York or Miami or Chicago, please go to some libraries and see, because you will learn something fundamental about the United States and what it is. So I tell people, first of all, you should go into those places to see the society. Second of all, get past the homeless people you find at one table and look around at the other activities that are there, because you will find in the library, when you go to the citizenship class, when you go to the children's reading group, when you see people, learning to study English or going to a book club for older people, you will see, and I write about this in Palaces for the People, you will see the kind of hope and opportunity and possibility and commonality that is what's fundamentally special about the United States and what's fundamentally special about being in an open society that's a democracy. And so I think that as right as you are, there's still possibility.
Hi, Eric. Just a question or some thoughts I want to share with you. I guess that as in Europe, in the States, all the libraries were closed during the lockdown, I guess so. And so the thoughts that I want to share with you is that we know that in the future, there will be more and more crises. There has been crises in the past due to climate change, like the one you described in Chicago. Here in Europe, almost every summer, we have some heat waves. We also know that due to the loss of biodiversity, there is an increase in terms of pandemic. 1 century ago, there was one pandemic every century. This century, we have already encountered 5 pandemics. It is due to the loss of biodiversity. So my thought is, shouldn't we vote or rethink social infrastructure to be more resilient in the future, no? So that they don't have to be closed during the crisis. This is a lesson that I think that we have to learn from the actual situation, no? It's a thought, or it's a thought that I want to share with you. It's a question to you. What do you think about this? No, shouldn't we think social infrastructure as more resilient element, and how should this be in terms of space or program, for instance? No, I guess that during the lockdown in the US, the library were closed, and the people who go to the library were just left to themselves. So yeah, what are your thoughts?
So first of all, you're totally right. This is a great idea, and it's something that we've been working on, very much. How do you create social infrastructure that can be useful, can be a resilient center, right? Can also be a resilient center. And that means, for climate, can you make sure that places are, have backup energy, so if the power goes out, which happens here all the time, they can maintain power. Can you have a wireless mesh network so that if the internet system goes out, it can remain a communications hub? Can you make sure that it has good flood protection so the library or the park itself stays above ground? Can you make sure it has flexible design so the rooms can be adapted for different uses if you need to turn the library into a place where you're staging an emergency food distribution efforts? And so there are all kinds of amazing design questions that you can ask about how would you retrofit the social infrastructure we already have so that it can meet the demands of a future on a climate changed planet, right? Our infrastructure needs to be different. I will say that during the pandemic, libraries closed their doors. You're not, invited into the library. But one of the amazing stories of the pandemic here in the US is the extent to which libraries wound up adapting and maintaining their programming and their role in the civic infrastructure. So for instance, many libraries dramatically expanded their digital offerings, so you could get books and newspapers and magazines more freely than you could before. Many continued doing the classes that they do, so children's literacy or adult reading groups or film groups, things like that. The classes switched to Zoom or to Microsoft Teams like we're on today, right? And so this part of the social activity remained. Some librarians moved from the physical building of the library out to playgrounds and started to help children who needed an outdoor place to play be engaged more seriously. Many libraries, almost I would say most libraries, started a service where you could order books and they would put them out on they called it curbside pickup. Libraries also amplified their Wi-Fi signals. Like I said, in the United States, where we don't have great Wi-Fi access, libraries provide a lot of that. And so libraries made it easier for people to come to the area around the library, sit on a bench, and get Wi-Fi. And that mattered in the United States because schools closed down here, schools went remote, but in order to do remote school, you need to have a device and you need to have Wi-Fi access. And a lot of people would go to remote school or remote work from the area around the library. And so while it's true that libraries had to shut down because we didn't want people inside, they didn't fully shut down. In fact, they did some remarkable things. And that speaks, I think, to the side of this, which we're not emphasizing as much, and that's not just the building itself, but the programming, which is the more human element, right? The work that people do when they are making sure that our social infrastructure works as well as it can. And that requires an investment as well, because it means having public employees doing jobs.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I still have maybe one question. We still have about half an hour, if that's okay for you. So I will have short question, then we will take as many questions as we can from the public, from the audience, and maybe you can give us shorter answers to those questions so we can review most of them. I had this question about. Well, I'm not an architect. You are not, but Benoit and Geoffrey are architects, and we have also concerns for the design of this infrastructure in the COVID city or in the post-COVID city, and how an interdisciplinary dialogue between sociologists like you and architects or designers can be a very crucial aspect of the condition of success of this social infrastructure to come. And I believe that when you talk about palaces for the people, you're not only talking about the large palaces for the people, but also what you called in a lecture the small palaces, if such a thing exists, a small palace for the people, small centers or small libraries that we will find in the neighborhoods that are not maybe the hot places of the city. And it's very important here in Brussels too, and maybe we can exchange on that, because during the pandemic, you here in Brussels, you saw that all the very large and ample public spaces have been at the center of the focus of the interest. A lot of people were going to the forest, the Bois de la Cambre, and places like that, very huge forest in the city, like I guess Central Park has been a place very important during the pandemic in New York. Maybe, I don't know, you will tell us. Or other places like the very large boulevards that are now accessible to pedestrians in the center of the city is also considered as what a public space should be now, and because these places are considered as less dangerous or less a challenge for Corona. But in smaller places, like I said, smaller libraries, or places like maybe the Seward Park Library that you evoke, or in your book, you have all these very places that are can be seen as maybe narrow or confined, or that are not large and big buildings, but that are important for the people. And I believe that in Brussels, the ongoing situation goes in the direction of feeding this ideology that big is beautiful for the city government. They already had this discourse, to make big things, big buildings, big public spaces, like mega public spaces. And I guess that the situation of and the danger of contagion, feeds this ideology, let's say, of the city. So what can we do for these small palaces for the people, and how can these places get adapted to the challenge of contagion and of the fear of close contacts? It's a real question, I guess, not only for the small buildings or the small social establishments, but also for the small open places like pocket parks, or like the very small parks in the city where people go at the neighborhood level. So what do you think?
I think this is I wish I had an answer for how you adapt highly dense places so that you can make them safer for infectious disease pandemics like COVID. I think, to be honest, that it's precisely during infectious disease pandemics that we really need to rely more on screens for these kinds of interactions. And for me, the thing we're doing right now makes a lot of sense for a moment like this. What I fear is that there is an army of organizations that is ready to pounce on us at the moment that the pandemic ends to say, don't go to the office, don't go to the park, don't go back to campus. Wasn't your work life better when you could do it from home? Wasn't learning better when you could do it online? Maybe we could do it cheaper. I anticipate that there will be a very big push for us to circulate less and spend more time on our screens, in our homes in the future. I mean, we know this is happening, right? We know this is coming. It's already happening. And, so I guess I think in a moment like this, if you really want to be safe in a pandemic, you don't spend as much time in a tight space, period. You do spend more time outdoors. If you want to adapt a building so it's more safe for COVID, that means improving the ventilation system, right? It means dealing with kind of the basic infrastructure so that the air circulates more freely. It means figuring out how to have more small green open space in a densely populated neighborhood. The pocket parks do matter, community gardens and things like that, rooftop gardens, the kinds of things that are on the agenda for transforming cities for climate change. Those things really matter as well. I think there's a lot of anxiety still in the United States that we will go through a period of anti-urbanism where people will become anxious about living in densely populated cities, and there'll be another push to the suburbs, because that obviously happened at a different point in American history and contributed a lot to our class segregation and racial segregation. Cities have come back in the United States, and there's a fear, and we don't yet know whether it's legitimate or whether it's just paranoia, but there's a fear that affluent people are going to flee the city and leave those cities without the tax base that they need to provide services. Here again, there's a very specific thing in the United States, which is that a lot of the funding for things like parks and schools and services comes not from the federal government, from the nation state, but it comes from the local government. And so it really matters for a city in the US, whereas I think it matters less if people move move out of Brussels to go somewhere out in the suburbs. It probably matters a lot less for the schools of Brussels than it does for the schools of New York.
Yeah. Maybe let's go to the question, Eric, if it's okay for you. I don't know if you can see them in the chat.
I can. I see that the first question I see is about how can you build social infrastructure according to the needs of populations that rely on it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is a question I think I tried to address this by talking about rebuild by design. When we did this competition and tried to generate social infrastructure projects, the idea was before anyone would design something, let alone build it, before you'd even design it, you would do 3 months of research on the place itself, which meant looking carefully at the different needs and vulnerabilities and possibilities in the place, and then also doing extensive outreach with the people who live in the space, what we call them the stakeholders, people whose lives will really be affected by what you build. And so, in the United States now, it's become more and more common for designers and planners and local policy people to do fairly intensive collaboration with the communities that are going to be affected by the project. It doesn't happen as much as it needs to. It could happen much more. And Unfortunately, poor people, poor communities are less likely to have their interests listened to and respected than affluent communities. There's a fundamental inequality here. But I'm very much an advocate for making the design process as participatory and democratic as it can be, and that's what we did for Rebuild by Design.
Maybe it's good to. I see that the question of Louise was relatively close. I mean, the relation between how to design, let's say, in relation to the need, and then we have the question of Bas, hi Bas, our colleague from VUB, that is rather different. Might be interesting to go over them.
Okay. I really did talk without notes. I do not have a teleprompter.
Can you read the question maybe? So
yeah. Well, she just wanted to know if I really spoke without notes. So the question is, what about ownership? She says you offer a very convincing story about the importance of physical places, but then primarily focus on social relations and interaction. To what extent does the kind of ownership of infrastructure, state-owned or not, public-private, shape our capacity to interact? So I think this matters tremendously, and I'm sorry I was not as specific about it as I could have been. There's a talk I give where I talk about this at great length. In fact, like if you go, you mentioned Seward Park, this neighborhood library in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and I like to contrast Seward Park, which is publicly owned, which means it is accessible to everyone. You do not have to spend $1 to get in there. They can't kick you out because you've spent too much time there. It's a very open and accessible place. I contrast that with the Seward Park is in a neighborhood that's been gentrifying, and there's a lot of very expensive new restaurants and coffee shops. Some of them don't take cash. They only accept credit cards, and they are set up to exclude people from entering. So it's very clear that those are social infrastructure that work for a specific clientele of people who can pay to play. Now, let's be clear that, and I should also say that, the low-level commercial venues in that neighborhood, places like McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts, they have signs on the wall that say no loitering, which means you can't sit and stay for more than 30 minutes in McDonald's, even if you paid for something. And the way that works in practice is that if I go into McDonald's and I order a cup of coffee and I bring my laptop, I can sit in that McDonald's for 6 hours before anyone would say anything to me. And they probably would only say, could you excuse me for a second while I clean your table? But if I were homeless, or if I was very poor and I looked it, or if I were black, they could come to me in 30 minutes and say, you've been here for your limit, you need to leave the store. And so, of course, social infrastructure, and then the extreme version of that is the country club, right? There's probably no better social infrastructure for building relationships than the country club, the private club, members only. They have all kinds of programming. They have great facilities. They have all kinds of activities. They can cater to your individual needs, but only if you have a lot of money to pay for it. And so I think there are different kinds of social infrastructure that are real. It's not like the club, the private club is not social infrastructure. But if I'm interested in promoting a democratic society, what I'm most interested in is publicly owned, democratically accessible social infrastructure.
Yeah, maybe we have a question from Louis. So how it's quite similar to the first one, how to define and design the social infrastructure that need to be created or renovated in a specific area?
I think it is, again, I'll just say,
yeah,
to the extent that it's like city planners and architects who come to a neighborhood and say, this is what you need, or have a standard thing that they do, and we say plug and play. They plug it in and just say, go ahead. To the extent you do that, you're going to have a mismatch. But like if I came into the banlieue around Paris and I said, okay, we're going to set up a bunch of American football, US football stadiums here so you can play, Nobody's going to be very interested in that. There's going to be a failed project, even if they work in every place I've done projects in the suburbs of Pennsylvania and Ohio. They're not going to work very well in the banlieue unless I put some soccer or European football goals, and then suddenly everyone could play again, right? So you would be amazed at the extent to which city planners and governments go into neighborhoods and fail to think about what local needs and interests are. Should we go to Mark?
Yes, indeed. About the question of solidarity, you were saying.
Yeah.
The core of his question.
So the question is, am I talking about what Durkheim would call mechanical solidarity, which is kind of like we're bonded because we're all the same, right? We share the same place, or is the solidarity I'm talking about the more contemporary modern solidarity Durkheim was interested in is organic, in which people play different roles in society. You have a division of labor, and we become we recognize that we're mutually dependent. You know, we are interdependent, not autonomous, and that's the first thing. And so, you know, maybe what we need to do is think about the ways in which we can come together to support one another in a dynamic way, with each of us playing different roles. I agree with that. Actually, I have a much more dynamic sense of what happens even in a library is not just a shared space where everyone comes to the same place and does the same thing. One of the remarkable things about a library is that it has rooms and programs for many different kinds of people and attracts different people as they're doing different things. They come into contact and can recognize each other's differences. And then if you have a crisis, people play different roles. Or if there's not even a smaller crisis, not a pandemic, but let's say there's a neighborhood problem around gentrification and the displacement of businesses, or the class transformation of a neighborhood, or there's an incident of police brutality and racial conflict. The library provides a staging ground for a conversation. It's a common venue that people share, but it's a safe place that allows those differences to come out in a way that's not, screaming at each other on Twitter or social media. It allows for our humanity to get expressed in some different way. So I think that we're kind of past the age where mechanical solidarity is even within the realm of the possible, because we're such a differentiated society at this point. And I'm interested in social infrastructure precisely insofar as it allows people to recognize the variety that we have in modern societies, and to start to build bridges. I see we have one last question.
Yes, indeed. One about contemporary museum. Are they the social infrastructure of our time?
Well, I still think it depends on the society. I mean, in the United States, libraries are they're heavily used, they're accessible, they're programmed, they play the special role. It's possible museums are more like that in Europe and in some big American cities. The thing about museums is, and I know this is an issue in Europe, is that they have a long history of privileging the culture of elite groups. They privilege the art of elite groups. They marginalize the cultural production of the global South, of immigrants, of poor people, of Black people, of Arab people, and so they have a long history of being exclusive institutions that represent high culture delivered to the masses. And the problem is that even though every museum curator, director I know goes to great lengths to try to change that, and to program differently, and to curate differently, and to make communities feel like they are welcome, they continue to have the reputation of being exclusive places where elite culture is celebrated in a hierarchical system in which some people are placed above others. So in the United States, I've done a lot of work with museum directors who say, even if we make the museum free, if we have no entrance cost, even if we have a special exhibit, honoring the work of Black artists from the Harlem Renaissance, we will still get a mainly white audience here, and a mainly affluent audience. And that's because you can't compensate for the problems of the past by simply getting rid of the fee structure for a month or changing the exhibit. If you really want to make museums work better as social infrastructure, people who run museums have to do much more outreach to make everyone feel welcome, have to do much more kind of soul searching and institutional transformation to make it so that the museum feels like a more democratic space as well. And it's very tricky for museums to do that because museums are generally programmed by people who think that they have a kind of special kind of knowledge and expertise in how to do things that are culturally significant and important. And you know, brokering that situation is very, very tough. But I've been pushing museums in the United States to be much more radical about how they do it.
Okay, maybe one more question about this time about the internet and how this virtual space infrastructure can relate to the physical or social infrastructure. How the internet can be a part of the social infrastructure according to you? Is it also a place where we can, I mean, that can have the same, in a way, a similar function to what physical places can have? Maybe for the people who are alone in their house, they can interact on the social network, and maybe if they don't, people will notice, and people will you know, be worried about not seeing them anymore on a forum or on Facebook or whatever. So can it have a similar function to some of the places that you studied in these neighborhoods in Chicago during the heat wave? That would be the first part of the question. The second part being that yes, I know that you do sometimes talk for Facebook or for Google or this sort of very of course important actors of the web. So I'm just curious about what you say to these people.
Well, so I think it's a great question, and I've actually been working with a guy who writes a lot about the way the internet works named Eli Pariser, who wrote a great book called The Filter Bubble, on a project that says, how can we take what we've learned about the way that social life works on, you know, in the public realm and incorporate it into the internet to try to make the internet less of a kind of polarizing place. You know, so this is his question, not mine, but there's a world of designers that are interested in, like, you know, making a better Facebook. How can you make a place where there's less polarization? Is it content moderation? You know, is it access? I'm not an expert on these things by any means, you know, but there is a world of tech people who are trying to learn about what makes a good public space and incorporate those things in. So, you know, diversity of access, something that kind of reduces the attractiveness of conflict, and you know, moderation is often a part of that, although moderation is very time-consuming and difficult. But there are definitely people who are working on it. And look, I say in my book that I don't think that the internet isn't really social infrastructure, it's a communications infrastructure. Social infrastructure is the physical stuff that allows us to engage each other face to face. Communications infrastructure, you know, helps us, you know, broker relationships, but not in the same way. But that's a contentious argument. You know, one could have a really big debate about and say, well, look, you know, there are a lot of people, like, you know, maybe you have a very rare disease and it's hard to find other people who share that disease with you, and you can't do it based on where you live. But if you go online, you can find an entire forum full of people who have that disease also from around the world, and you can build relationships and share information. Right? There's a story about, you know, the dating for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people much better online in the digital space than it is in physical spaces meeting people, because it's just easier to identify your group and communicate that way. So the numbers in terms of, I wrote a book about online dating once, and the numbers of of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender dating online, it's huge compared to straight people. So it's not that I think that you can't do social things on the internet. It's that I think that ultimately there's a difference between the kinds of relationships that we have access to face and the kinds of relationships that we build face to screen, which is why, generally speaking, the relationships that are really sustainable, wind up moving from the screen to the analog world. When I go into Facebook or Twitter or some other place and give a talk, I will say exactly the same things I say to you, but I'm a little more pointed and critical of them for their model. I was invited to be the keynote speaker at Facebook's big conference for researchers last year, where I went to the mothership in Menlo Park and spoke to 1,000 Facebook people, and got a meeting with the number 3 person at Facebook, and basically told them I thought it was ludicrous for them to call themselves the social infrastructure for the 21st century, and I thought they owed, at a minimum, they owed the world more honesty, and they also owed, they had a responsibility, if they were saying they cared about community, to help support the development of physical places in communities where people could come together and not use the internet. And so the week after I visited Menlo Park and said that to the number 3 person, Facebook announced, I don't know, $60 or $70 million to build a library and community center in the poor part of Menlo Park, not far from where they live. So in some ways that was a modest victory, but this is one of the biggest companies on Earth, and they matter, not just in Menlo Park but everywhere on the planet. And so, until Facebook makes that kind of commitment to everybody else and stops doing some of the horrible, outrageous things that they're doing to make us a more divided world with less reliable information, I will be a very active critic. And if they want to invite an active critic to come into their door and tell them what they're doing wrong, I'm more than happy to do that.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Eric. I think it's a good time to conclude this session. So, first of all, sorry to you and to our audience for the little technical difficulty. It was a first session. So sorry, you've been our you helped us with this experimentation, but now we'll be prepared for the sessions to come. We know that you are preparing a book about this very weird and dangerous year, 2020, a social autopsy. Is it a social autopsy, the title?
It is, yeah.
Okay, so it's I guess a reference to your book on the heat wave in Chicago. Is it the same second title, right?
It has that concept, social autopsy, in it. Yeah.
Okay. So of course we'll be very interested to read it as soon as it is released. Well, thank you so much for this presentation. Like Bas van Heur said, it was impressive to see you improvise this talk without a PowerPoint presentation. So thank you for that, and congratulations for that. And it's been like
you should all do it.
Yes, yeah, right.
We
know that you have a lot of training too. Huh? So yes, we were very happy to have you as a first speaker, because you really formulated all the elements that will be used in the coming sessions. This very concept of social infrastructure that you proposed will be used and observed and addressed from different disciplinary perspectives and angles. And of course, we'll let you know about these next sessions. We will not only record them, but we will work on the proceedings, so to speak, of this webinar. So we will prepare that early next year, and we will we'll let you know, both to the audience and to you, Eric, if you're interested.
Well, I hope to see you in Belgium before too long.
Oh yes, yes, maybe, hopefully. So, and of course, we also hope you, not this sort of nightmarish situation on a political level that you're going through right now, and that you all can have hopefully a decent conclusion to this very crazy episode. Okay. So thank you to all, and again, thank you, Eric.
Bye.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.